Hello, welcome to episode number 58 of CXO-Talk. I am Michael Krigsman, here with my favorite co-host, Vala Afshar. Vala.
Hi, Michael. I believe I'm the only co-host, but okay.
You are the only co-host, but the favorite co-host as well.
Okay, great.
And we're joined today by Brian Stevens, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Red Hat.
Good afternoon, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Michael. Hi, Vala. How are you doing?
Good, good. So you just took the red eye in from somewhere.
Can you tell?
Well, you did. You told us before. Otherwise, we couldn't tell.
Yeah, no, we couldn't tell until you told us, and now we definitely can tell. No, I'm kidding. So Brian,
I've got enough caffeine in me.
Briefly tell us about Red Hat.
Red Hat's an interesting company. I've headquartered out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I think we've been at open source for 20 years as a development model, and working with our customers, who we usually refer to as our partners, on helping them modernize their infrastructure software by moving to open source solutions.
First billion-dollar open source company, is that accurate?
Yeah, we're actually have always been one of the fastest growing software companies of any category, open source and proprietary. But yeah, at this time, it's a little bit unfortunate. It's great that we broke the billion-dollar threshold, but we're also to this day the only profitable open source company. So we're hoping that some of the mistakes that we encountered along the way and what works really well, is a path that others will follow in the future, and there'll be a lot more billion-dollar companies.
And it's for our audience, it's development by community, and then professional quality assurance and subscription-based services model. Is that accurate?
Yeah, probably the first 7 to 8 years that we were in the business, that you always hear the term packager or distributor when you hear about open source, and I think that was the model. That was the early model of Red Hat in the late 90s, and that's really where the brand was garnered. But in the early days, it was taking open source content and being the manufacturing for it to deliver to customers, and under largely a license model.
Okay.
And that's not a good business. That's not a very good business. And I think what we learned as we entered the enterprise, and about 12 years ago, was customers didn't really just value somebody delivering code to them. They really wanted a full relationship. So in 2001 was really the pioneering, I think, for the industry around what's a software subscription look like, and what's a more robust relationship with a customer need to be around open source or around anything, to be honest. That moves you out of the perpetual licensing model into a richer engagement.
Sure. So it's the so it's not just the software, but the enterprise buyers, you say, want a more complete relationship. And what does that actually mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it changes every day. When we think about, we have whole teams that think about how do we add more day-to-day value in a customer relationship through a richer relationship. So we always are trying to find innovative ways to actually understand that, as opposed to coming back 3 years looking for a renewal, right? You haven't been around for it. So we try to be a part of our customers' lives on a daily basis by continuous value. Some of the big aspects of the subscription are, customers don't want to integrate software, and they don't want to validate software by the time it reaches their premise, open source or otherwise. They expect everything to work. So a lot of what happens inside of our four walls is making sure not only can we be like the guiding post and influencing the future direction of all the technology, and that's why we have to have a heavy R&D emphasis, not just a packager or distributor. It's that guiding direction that gives you the knowledge, and you can impart knowledge as well to your customers. But in addition to that, it's all about the ecosystem. So it's really, what are all of the other partners and ecosystems, suppliers to our customers, and how do they work with our software? and that starts, those relationships and that integration and validation starts, years ahead of even software delivery. And so we've got, a large lab that's really all about interoperability from every piece of hardware you can imagine to every piece of software. And so by the time you deliver, customers expect it to work. And that's a big part of what they're paying for, is they're using us not just for knowledge, but reducing the risk so that they can take advantage of open source.
Sure. So as the Chief Technology Officer, we're interested to know your role and how you orchestrate the efforts of R&D, the robustness of the ecosystem, and how you ultimately achieve that mission of establishing solid relationships with your customers and partners.
But before you do that, I'm going to ask you to adjust your bandwidth settings, because your audio is really bad. And if you look at the top of your screen, see those little, looks like cell phone bars along the top, the icons of the Google. Don't you guys love Google Plus and Google Hangouts?
Google Plus.
Back a notch.
And if you notch it to the left a little bit, it'll reduce it'll free some audio up, some bandwidth up for your audio.
Great.
Okay. All right, try that and see how that is.
That sounds better.
Is it better already?
Yeah, it is. Great.
Do I look grainier?
You're a little bit grainier, but we hear you better, and it's your silky smooth voice.
Wow, it's 58 episodes, and that's the first time I've heard silky smooth voice. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Vala, you were asking the question.
Yeah, Brian's role as the CTO, because as what he described, it seems like it requires a level of orchestration and vision to realize. So can you talk to us a little bit about your role as the CTO?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shared responsibility. I wouldn't necessarily, I think it'd be overstating to call it orchestration, but it's really just trying to be really connected with, the technology that we're getting behind, the technology strategy, the investments we're making, new product lines, M&A, just really understanding what the opportunity for us to grow, not just, quarter over quarter, but really looking out, 2 to 3 years even. And making sure that Red Hat's making those investments with the existing portfolio, as well as sort of paving the way into some of the new areas that we probably aren't going to productize for years to come. So it's actually, it's a fun job of actually, getting immersed at where technology solves business problems, as opposed to too far down the weeds of just, lower levels of technology, which, we've got whole teams of engineers on that are just phenomenal.
Right.
So, it's pretty interesting to me. I find it amazing that a company that gives its product away can generate, your last year's revenue was like $1.53 billion.
Right.
So
yeah.
How does that work? How do you make $1.5 billion giving away what you do for free? It's like the ultimate freemium model.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think even in 2001, when we exited the retail business and said we're not selling $80 a box product on a perpetual basis anymore, and we said customers want a subscription, even then was a bet the company decision. And what seems obvious now wasn't obvious then. And so I think it's just the realization that there's this massive economic benefit as customers are able to more fully take advantage of modernizing their infrastructure around open source. But the knowledge to do that is non-trivial, right? I mean, if you're a Google or a Facebook, you probably have that knowledge on your team already. But, if you're the 99% of the rest of the marketplace, you don't. And, we're the expert on that. And so we have with that 1.5 billion of, revenues last fiscal year, we probably saved our clients 10 times as much just in cost as they moved to that. So we're returning dollars back into their wallet, and at the same time giving them better operational efficiency. So it's kind of this win-win model that is proving itself out quarter over quarter.
Can you explain open source software to our audience, and also talk about that order of magnitude savings that your customers realize? How does that come about?
I think in the early days, open source was a couple things. It was sort of thought of as a business model, and we know that it's not a business model. To us, really, open source it's clearly a license, right? And so for the audience, open source is a license and there's hundreds of different open source licenses, but some of the most popular ones are this thing called the GPL, and that's the the dominant license for our business. And what it means is that when you supply applications or software that's based on an open source license, you also have to give the person you give the software to the code. Right? That's highly unusual when you think about companies that are competing or otherwise want to differentiate. That's what happened in the old decade, is that companies were keeping code to themselves to differentiate, and then they end up what happens with that is that then the vendor owns all the innovation. And so with open source, because of the license, the innovation and the investment on a technology basis is happening all over the world. So we consider that it's not just 6,500 people at Red Hat that are working on the code. The whole industry is working on the same code base that we're delivering to our clients. So you get this shared development team, which makes the end product all the better. And then the last part about it is customers have this feel that that they own code, which they do. And so they feel like that they need an exit, right? And when customers move to something, you need to know the cost to exit. And I think that with open source, they have that confidence that, despite their vendor, that they have an exit.
Does that collaboration lead to better security, better scale, better? I mean, certainly there's that element of, code development but does the product, for example, more secure because it has input from the community?
Well, we believe so, and I think that there's been studies as long ago as 5 years ago that talked about not necessarily security specific but defect specific, and they compared open source and specifically the Linux kernel against other proprietary platforms, a defect ratio of a 10 to 1 improvement, right? And so, less defects means less security vulnerabilities as well. And it's kind of obvious when you think about it. If the world is always trying to penetrate, you'd love to see it's, this is a big group hug, but there's a lot of people that are trying to penetrate what is now a digital economy.
Sure.
And so think about what these businesses that are, which is everybody now that is web centric and has to have their applications for systems of engagement, they're under constant attack. And moreover, the people that are attacking even know what code that people are running, and they still can't get in. So it just goes to show you that even when you have, there's no obscurity in this model, and because of that, it gets hardened even all the more. You're not relying on one vendor to actually build you security code. That vendor's conflicted in trying to drive more revenue and working on features. So as we're all the sort of the code's out there, we really believe it's the most secure platform on the planet, and that's why it's running all of the cloud infrastructure. That's why it's running Facebook and Twitter and Google. And these are public services that if they go down, it's more than impact on their financials. It's an impact on the world all over. And they're running the same code base that, from a security perspective, that clients want to run.
Brian, do me a favor, adjust that bandwidth slider one more time because your voice is breaking up again.
Okay.
Thank you. One more notch. Now, of course, the fly in the ointment for security and open source is what happened with OpenSSL, where it was free and therefore people just simply relied upon it without sufficient scrutiny, and it screwed up one of the basic security mechanisms of all of the internet.
Sure. Yeah, the reality is I think that people need, in a way, I mean, it was a tragic, right? But in a way, you need to it was that wake-up call as well, right? It was the wake-up call that you can't take security for granted. It was a wake-up call, I think, for the open source industry. It was a wake-up call for customers, big vendors, commercial entities. And the reality is that, I don't think anybody would ever tell you that any code was vulnerability-free, right? We wouldn't stand in front and say that we never would have that open source is vulnerability-free, and I don't think any other proprietary vendor would dare say that either. And so the reality is that what's the best platform to run on and what's safer. And I think what you don't want to be in this industry is you don't want to be out on a ledge. You don't want to be alone. If you're running a platform, and if you're going to build a business, I'd probably want to be running on the exact same code platform that, these large-scale companies like Google was. So they're looking at the code as well, right? You don't want to be the only, you don't want to have one vendor on your side. You want to have the industry on your side. And so the reality is, look at how that got found, right? That was found by an engineer at Google, right? Finding it. It wasn't even found by the vendor or the end user or even the hacker. It was found before it was exposed. And then the industry worked together on a disclosure process, and we're looking today on, like, can we make that disclosure process even better? But it worked really well, and we think that it got stronger. But it's just the reality of the world that we're in.
Sure. We have a question from Twitter from Kip McCam, and Kip's question is...
Or Meacham.
Or Meacham, yeah, McCam, Meacham.
Hopefully we're not saying it wrong, Kip, but we like your question. Anyways.
Kip, the question is good, so sorry if I mispronounce your last name. Doesn't open source software development drive down the value/wage a software engineer can command?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, we're definitely in this global economy, where the the developers are globally involved now. What we've observed is that there's this massive opportunity and need for skills around open source, because that's where everything's moving to.
Sure.
So there's countless opportunities now for people right out of college or even retraining to become mobile developers, open source mobile developers, cloud infrastructure, understanding OpenStack, software-defined storage. These whole new categories of software that never existed before, and there's a lot of them are even ahead of training. The technology is even getting ahead of some of the training capability that's out there. So for any young engineer that wants to become an expert in open source or or sysadmin skills or otherwise, there's many companies that would be standing in line to hire you.
That makes sense.
So I'm assuming that the benefit of open source and the reason companies buy you is not primarily financial, because if you think about a fairly large software system, I think the cost of the license generally is relatively small compared to the labor and the services that are required to get everything up and running.
Right.
So to what extent is the open source decision for customers a financial one or non-financial?
Right. It's always a little bit of both, right? In the early days, we talked about replacement products, and you looked at Linux in the early days was viewed as a replacement for primarily Unix, and so as part of that, it delivered it was easy in many cases to deliver a 100-to-1 price performance advantage as you moved to Red Hat and Intel. And then what happened was this discovery process happened along the way. It was what they thought they were doing was like helping just with their license costs, and then they realized that they all of a sudden were sitting on a better, more performant, more secure platform that was driving innovation faster. And so that was sort of, we consider the whole first chapter of the company was, to be honest, replacing proprietary software with Linux, with BOSS, something that's heavily standardized. But you're right in that if you talk to a CIO today, and their challenge is bigger than just license costs, right? They're operationally inefficient by and large.
Sure.
So if working with an organization, you don't understand, how to make a massive operational swing and a massive operational improvement in the organization, then you're just pushing product at them, and customers don't want more product; they want operational change. So really, that's where the two come together. So they're not at odds with each other. It's like, okay, so how do you build that operational platform that drives a higher degree of agility and efficiency for customers? And to be honest, the only way to do that these days is on open source. It's really where you're seeing all the innovation happen. It's hard to find innovation happening by and large out there. I mean, the last hurrah was probably VMware, and that's now 75% of the marketplace. And now you're looking at cloud capability and big data capability and SDN, and all that innovation's happening in open source. And these aren't replacement architectures. These are brand new, modernizing architectures that will deliver that operational impact.
I think you may have answered Zachary Jean's question. Zach just asked on Twitter, where is Red Hat seeing the biggest need for their solution over the next decade? You mentioned cloud, big data, analytics, software-defined networking, SDN. But could you maybe add to that in terms of where the biggest needs may be for your solution in the next few years?
We really feel like, to be honest, that our revenue growth is driven off our core business, right? So the success of Red Hat Enterprise Linux and JBoss.
Sure.
It's still early days. I mean, I was in you think that the Unix to Linux thing would run its course, but it's just not, right? The only two growing platforms at the operating system level are Windows and Red Hat Enterprise Linux these days. So all new apps are put on one of those two platforms. And as much as you might find customers that are farther ahead than others, and and they're running 90% of their infrastructure on Red Hat. I was in Canada for 3 days last week, meeting with customers there and the Canadian government. They're right at the beginning. They get where they need to go, but they're really at the beginning. So it's really interesting to see that, even from a core business perspective, that we still feel like it's early, and that's what fuels the company. And then meanwhile, you see, the forward-looking customers saying that I want to move towards a different operational platform as well. Once I get to Linux and x86, then I want to look at like cloud architectures, and I want to look at, geez, that thing called AWS is really efficient, and it's got a really nice usability experience for the developers and IT. How do I get me some of that? But how do I put it on my premises? And so that is what we look at as, while we're investing towards the future where customers want to go, and that means SDN, and we did an acquisition this week of a small company that is redefining, scale-out storage. These are our customers want to get to, and that's a journey with them. We know that's, the conversations are there, the POCs are there, but it takes a long time to move from replacing an operating system to deploying a whole new architecture.
We have a comment, not so much a question, but a comment from Frank Scavo, who is an industry analyst, and he says one cloud vendor told him recently that Oracle scales technically, but it doesn't scale economically. So, any thoughts on Oracle?
That's the example I always use for VMware trying to get to the cloud. So, Oracle, I don't know. I mean, it depends on which part of Oracle, I suppose, right? Oracle's a big company with lots of products, so I think that the difference is that what we're seeing is customers, when it comes to cloud, customers want to follow the industry, right? Nobody wants to have a single vendor, path, and they don't want to, they're not going to let one vendor like VMware pick their path to cloud, because there's a capability that certainly doesn't scale financially, and certainly doesn't scale technically either. Oracle, I think, continues to be a laggard in driving any innovation other than grabbing all the ecosystem around primarily the database and applications. When it really comes to getting the next generation, people are looking at the cloud architectures that, to be honest, the largest companies in the world have achieved, and how do they deliver operational scalability, and how do they emulate that? And that really comes back to open source and primarily things like OpenStack.
I'm skipping all my questions because the folks on Twitter are smarter than I am. Question from Ann Uspio. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, but Anna asks, what do you find most exciting about Red Hat's acquisition of Inktank this week?
I'm a big believer in brand. And that was one of the things that excited me coming to Red Hat almost 13 years ago, was the identity of who that company was and how customers felt about it. And that's a great place to be, right? The technology, to be honest, is the easy part after that. And that brand's really intact. It's as strong today as it was 13 years ago. And now when you look at what's happening in software scale-out, along comes this small company of 50 people, and they built a software scale-out technology that isn't a replacement product. It's allowing new unparalleled capability in terms of how do you build resiliency at the storage level across the same types of commodity servers that you're running your applications on.
Right.
So fine, great technology, and there's probably proprietary companies that are chasing the same model. But at only 50 people, they've built an awareness for their technology and a brand around SAF, which is the technology, the community technology, the world over. So, what we sort of invested in wasn't code. It was the brand of the company and the awareness the company has with their early clients and users, as well as a bunch of really smart people. And that's really who Red Hat is. So all of a sudden, because we had other options, right? We can just start putting our own developers on and deliver the technology or deliver competing technology. And in this business, people want to be on the default. You don't want to be number 2, number 3, number 4 in this world. Customers want to be on the number 1 platform. They know that's open source. And in the OpenStack world, which is where everybody's moving to, the default storage layer for OpenStack is Ceph. And so it made a nice addition to everything we've been doing around OpenStack.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking right now with Brian Stevens, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Red Hat. So this is a great time for you to ask questions of truly a leader in the open source industry. And it's also a great time for you to click the subscribe button and get the CXO-Talk newsletter. So is there when you're talking with customers inside large companies, is there a mindset that is required for them to be open and willing to adopt open source versus proprietary technologies?
It depends on what phase they're at. The leading companies, we basically, chased all the verticals that, Sun used to lead in 10 years ago, from, finance, FSI to telco to government and manufacturing, pharma, So in those industries that drove the economics behind our business model, it's really well understood. But that said, like I said, it's still really early days for some customers. There's always customers that, for whatever reason, it's still new to them. So really, it's the challenge then is usually around how do they get the skills inside their organization, not just technically, but really understanding the model of open source and what it means. And I think in that many people in the same case, as you think about like any proprietary company or anybody writing applications, in the case of open source, you're seeing that code being written on the internet. And so one of the early challenges was that what that meant was that I've seen in the early days many customers say, well, I grabbed this code that was out on the internet and it was open source and it didn't quite work how I expected it to. So therefore all open source is bad. It's just like anything, all code goes through a process and a life cycle and reaches base levels and hardening and integration and all that. So the challenge sometimes is for newer customers that are just getting their hands on open source to realize that not all open source is the same. There's a process around it. There might be commercial vendor relationships that they want to have around it, et cetera.
It sounds like you spend a lot of time in the field talking and engaging with customers. So I'm curious, how much time do you spend engaging with customers, and specifically, what do you see in terms of changes in IT?
I think you have to spend time in the field, right? You have to spend time with customers, and certainly, it's a two-way street. Certainly, it helps the execution of the sell-to relationship. But to be honest, the best part about it though is that standing in front of customers and exploring concepts, understanding where their primary concerns are, what their challenges are. If you don't understand that, you're a vendor sitting in your four walls guessing, right? And so I think that the challenge is to be very open, whether that's a formal thing like an advisory board or whether that's just a one-on-one relationship. And you need to have those relationships all the way through, from a developer to a sysadmin to a CTO to a CEO to a CIO. The whole chain, right? Because everybody's involved in this process and this journey. So yeah, I spend a lot of time. It's always trying to balance that time with being inside of Red Hat and doing all the things that we need to do. But I think it's critically important to get out and really have a true understanding of what's happening in the industry.
And what about as far as cloud goes? What do you do internally? Do you have a bias towards cloud systems inside Red Hat or towards on-prem? How do you handle things internally?
Well, on our IT organization, they eat a lot of really tasty dog food. So they do deploy a lot of what Red Hat's productizing. So they don't get ahead of us. They usually try to be the first customer number one, the technologies that we're building, I think they're really great at that. So that includes things like infrastructure clouds based on OpenStack, our platforms as service cloud based on OpenShift. So they're great at that. Not only do they use it, but then they also try to set things up like that as a service for the rest of the organization. We're also a user of, as much as we build internal capacity around cloud, because that presents a better operational model, we're also a big user of external cloud services. That was actually how our platform as a service really developed. As we had developers that just said, hey, there's this thing out here called Amazon. It's a lot easier to use that than for me to manage servers under my desk. And so that was sort of the aha moment for us, was watching how developers were using Amazon and realizing they got a little bit more efficient because they weren't managing hardware, but all of a sudden they became infrastructure managers, or just the infrastructure living in the cloud. They were managing all operating systems and storage, and they were just doing it in Amazon's cloud. And that was really drove the paradigm change for us, that we can actually build a product and capability for our developers that lets them use public cloud, but in a way where they don't have to become public cloud masters.
We have a question from Alan Berkson, who asks, does Red Hat only use open source for internal use, and is there pressure to do so? So I imagine I was going to make a snide comment, but I won't. I'll let you just answer.
No, we use a mix. That's one of the challenges. We would love to be all 100% pure open source, all the way down to the firmware, and I think that's who we are, and that's where we would like to be. But we're also really pragmatic to know at the same time we're a public company. Our customers depend on us. So I think on the R&D side, that whole R&D tool chain, you'll see, the development tools and everything else, that it's almost 100% open source. But our IT department has to set up a financial system that supports a $2 billion run rate business. And because of that, it means that there's probably products out there, cloud-based or otherwise, that are engineered toward that. Because predominantly we're an infrastructure company, we know it. And so someday, maybe software will truly eat the world and everything will be open source. But right now, we have a heavy bias towards open source.
There was a story of Bill Gates where he wouldn't allow his kids to have iPods. I don't know if that's true or not. But they were stuck with Zunes.
That's commitment to the brand. We have another question from Twitter from Sandra Panera. And Sandra asks, what percentage of your customers are mature, established organizations versus startups and small businesses?
There's a really long tail, and when you look at it, so I think like a lot of companies, the majority of your revenue is often delivered by the really small number of customers, just sort of the way the model works. But the tail is extremely long, and it goes all the way down to small businesses with maybe a couple of subscriptions, and so and because of that, a part of us, we have what we call the green berets, right? Both for a sales force as well as technologists and professional services, but we're also a very indirect company with over half the business is delivered through partners and integrators and value-added resellers. And that's incredibly important, especially when you have a long tail. So we tend to spend our direct time more with the larger customers that need constant love and nurturing and guiding posts, but then we have the channel to feed all the rest.
We have a question from Frank Scavo. Our feeling is, you're talking earlier about the importance of customers, and our feeling is that our listeners trump us.
I don't think I've asked the question yet. That's from
So Frank Scavo is back asking, what back office systems, ERP and financials, does Red Hat run internally?
Do we disclose that publicly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean we've been using some really popular cloud-based services, things like CRM as well for managing Salesforce, right? I mean you got to go best of breed. Our business is growing very aggressively, and then as we start to move this new era, we can't afford to be held back by the tools. And right now, we like a lot of things that's happening at Salesforce. We're still on some legacy Oracle app stuff. It's just sort of the nature of the game. I think there's a disruption that'll probably happen at some point for them unless they really innovate. But right now, it's they're pretty good at grabbing a captive audience through acquisition of all the meaningful applications that an IT department needs to support.
If you were giving advice to a CIO who's looking to migrate to open source, what type of IT skills should they be looking to bring on board?
Yeah, I think that in most cases that it usually starts with one person, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and I always feel, and we've seen this a lot as well. You might have a whole company that was sort of adversarial to open source, and then along comes, one person leaves. It's a very mobile workforce, right? I mean, the world is very small. One person leaves from one company, moves to that company. Now, next thing you know, they're like knocking it out of the park, right? Deploying an impact on the company. So I think by and large, you don't have to make it up anymore, even for a new organization. Is really recruit that agent of change that just has great knowledge and has had great success on deploying it, because they're out there everywhere from, you said, sysadmins on up. It usually starts with just fantastic sysadmins that really know how to scale this stuff.
We have another question. You guys are answering. I'm thrilled that you guys are asking so many questions of Brian Stevens, because it's just an unusual opportunity to get unfettered access to somebody like Brian. So this is great. So we have a question from Alan Maline, or Maline, apology if I'm mangling your name. How quickly, Brian, do you see the uptake of Project Atomic happening?
Wow, somebody, are you sure that wasn't a plant? That sounds like pretty amazing.
Is that from Krigsman?
No, it wasn't from Krish.
Yeah. Well, you know what? The Atomic's actually this new thing. It's only a couple weeks old in terms of like public disclosure, and what Atomic's about, rather than going too deep in Atomic, is what we're observing is that the world is virtualized already, and I think that it doesn't mean it's 100%, but it's the majority of IT infrastructure is already virtualized. I think as customers move to virtualization, they thought they were going to be done, right? And the VMware and other virtualization products were worth their money because of the capex costs they saved. And I think people thought it ended there, and then along comes two things. One, all of a sudden they see Amazon, and they realize, well, you know what? I'm virtualized, but I haven't built this multi-tenant, self-service, agile platform. I've just virtualized my servers. So on one dimension, you're seeing that, okay, I want to wrap an operational cloud model around virtualization. That's first and foremost. And then the second, what they've happened is, look at Amazon, right? So Amazon sells virtual machines, right? So the way to have a relationship with Amazon is you buy a virtual machine. So you're not buying a whole server, which is great, but you're buying a portion of that server. So our entry into Atomic and containers, what happened was, as we started to build that operational platform on top of Amazon, our platform is a service that we host it on Amazon and we bring it to customers directly and run it on premise. We have upwards of 1.5 million applications running right now on top of Amazon that come through our platform. And so if those 1.5 million applications all had to have their own virtual machine, the cost would be astronomical. Instead, what we've done is we've oversubscribed virtualization at Amazon, and so every one of those virtual machines has an operating system on it that is hosting several hundred applications. And so what's happening is this next generation of IT infrastructure is moving towards, is very advanced, but moving towards containerization. What containerization is doing is saying, okay, we're going to use the underlying hardware is going to be, we'll put virtualization hypervised on it, and that allows it to be heterogeneous. I can install RHEL, I can install Microsoft, and that's great. But then on top of the operating system, to get better density and better economics, they're containerizing the operating system. And today you can only do that with Linux. And so along comes Docker and these container technologies, and then our work around Atomic is actually making it easier when you build those 100 applications on top of one version of OS, and we have the infrastructure to make it security isolation so they can be apps on behalf of different business users with quality of service so they can't steal performance. And they can have their own application dependencies without worrying about the other guy. The whole Project Atomic wrapped around that is to make that easier for IT to manage those, easier for them to network those applications together now that are no longer virtualized. And so, so Atomic's sort of this early open source project, and then it's going to actually be, there'll be a version of RHEL that's delivered later this year that actually is the perfect host for these containerized applications.
Tell us a little bit about OpenStack.
OpenStack, I think, is really exciting. It's exciting and it's boring. The exciting part is that it's probably 3 to 4 years along. I lose track. Where like really early on, it was within a year, it was identified by the industry as that's the solution to private cloud and public cloud, because you look at it, as much as people want to compete and have that same model as Amazon, there's no code base under which to do so. Right? I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find an alternative. Then along comes the industry and says, you know what, we're going to work together on this problem. Everybody's involved. IBM, HP, Dell, Red Hat. Everybody just said, you know what, we're going to, through open source, we're all going to agree on the technical architecture and implementation for both private cloud as well as service provider cloud, and that's called OpenStack. So it really wasn't saying that was the most technically advanced capability even when it got started. It was just that we're all going to work together, and that's the vision that we want to do together. So immediately, all of a sudden, like Seth, all of a sudden you come along with now the boring part of it is that's all customers want to talk about, because every customer has seen that the industry's already voted, and so every time as a customer engagement, as a company like Red Hat, they're all looking for that's job number one. Mission number one is like, how can they get to a cloud deployment based on OpenStack? They already trust it's going to get there. Now they need the knowledge. So that's it's a great opportunity for Red Hat. It's just it's the same conversation at scale, and it's pulling us into new markets. It's really the first time telco's always been a big market of ours, but it's always been on the IT side, and now for the first time, every telco is looking at like how do they like redefine themselves and have really agile cloud-based services. But the only code base they know that they can do that on is OpenStack.
Sure. Can you tell us what Red Hat is doing to improve data and analytics capabilities of your customers?
Right. That's really important. I think that's that's where the power is. But I mean, I think that also is really early. What we've done is we've just said we focused at it from the infrastructure level. And we just said the first part about it is getting data out of its silos. And you look at the first path is you got to be able to retain the data for your customers. So you got to be able to scale the data, secure the data, store the data. And so that's really where we got into software-defined storage. And that all started with the acquisition of Gluster, which is the basis of Red Hat storage. We said, you know what, data's ingesting so fast. We can't, the legacy hardware technology isn't what's going to be able to store it, scale it cost effectively, or even from the velocity in which it's coming into. We need a software-based scale-out architecture that is as simple as adding another node, and we add more storage as well as more access. So that's the basis of Red Hat storage, and that was the first step. And so now you get your data out of silos and where it can be all into one namespace and integrated. The next part about that is then looking at the leading applications for data analysis, which is Hadoop, and now some of these new areas that are taking advantage of in-memory like VDAS. Instead of them having to build just an analytics silo where you got to do ETL, take data from this source, build a data warehouse to do analytics, our work around Red Hat storage is allowing you to run leading applications like Hadoop and VDAS right on top of that storage layer itself.
Right. We have a question from Frank Scavo, and question is, in practice, isn't OpenStack more of a solution for cloud providers as opposed to corporate data centers?
No, it's actually both. The cloud providers are moving there really quickly because they're the ones that are getting disrupted, right? So anybody in like the telco or otherwise that wants to compete in that world, most of them they're far behind probably already, for one thing, from the market leaders. And so they realize they need a platform that many are helping them to innovate on to get there. So certainly, any sort of new age cloud provider or telco refashioning as cloud are going down that path. But it's the same conversation with every commercial IT organization as well, because they're saying we virtualize, but that doesn't allow me to have a shared pool across my applications. It doesn't allow the IT department to allow self-service to their lines of business or their developers. It doesn't allow them to manage capacity both on-premise as well as to control and govern when they want to use capacity from the public cloud. And that's why OpenStack is incredibly important for enterprise IT as well. I think it's in 2 weeks, the next, twice a year, the OpenStack Foundation holds a summit And in 2 weeks, I encourage people to attend in Atlanta. It's probably a little late to even find a hotel. But the what you'll see there is not just like rich technology discussions on the future of OpenStack, but you'll see commercial enterprise alike that are there looking at how to move forward.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. Yet again, this has been a very fascinating introduction to the world of open source. And really, the part that amazes me the most is you've built this $1.5 billion business, and yet you give this stuff away.
Selling free software is hard, right? Yeah.
So maybe it's like, okay, you lose money on each one, but you make it up in volume. I don't know if it works that way.
You can't. It's that world where you don't. If you're naive enough to think you're going to monetize everything, then you're going to build the wrong model, and you're going to build barriers, right? And so you got to. We always say we want millions of users and hundreds of thousands of customers. And so I think if you can adapt to that model that says it's not a monetize 100%, that there's massive opportunities out there with customers that need a partnership.
And how about if we end, if there are people who are listening that are building open source, part of open source startups, what kind of advice would you give somebody who wants to build an open source business, just based on years of doing this now? What does your wisdom say?
I think I'd argue that you don't build an open source business. Instead you understand sort of what problem you're solving for customers, and by and large that probably means using an open source platform to achieve that. But your business value isn't that it's open source. That's just sort of the path to the end. Good
advice. Good advice. Well, Brian, thank you very much. That was the fastest 50 minutes, and really appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Great. Nice being here. Thank you, guys.
And you've been watching episode number 58 of CXOTalk. We've been talking with Brian Stevens, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Red Hat. And if you missed the beginning of this conversation, then go back and catch it on the replay, because if you're interested in open source, this has been the place to be.
Absolutely.
And Vala,
thanks.
I hope you have a great week.
Yeah, you too.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.